The idea of the economy as care, I think, is just very compelling. It resonates on a lot of levels. There's also a network of people doing really interesting work. So just from the flyers, from people who have been attending, I think it just seemed like a space that I wanted to be in and learn from and absorb from.
I think I really came in here with the kind of intentionality to know how we manifest these conversations outside of long Zoom meeting conversations, outside of designing campaigns and advocacy. How do we really just make it palatable and digestible through arts, through, the current culture? How do we tap into that frequency and sort of, make it a conversation that becomes part of everybody's concern? Yeah, so that's why I came here. Oh, Brixton is a crazy place, isn't it? Like, it is a cultural melting pot, but I think it's actually at the brink of that kind of conversion, but it also gave us an opportunity to actually fashion what that looks like. How do we involve the academics that are also part of the city, the rhythm, the heartbeat of the city, in a space that's evolving now? To, when you think about tax, right? Most of us that work in these spaces can't afford expensive houses. Brixton is our area, essentially, if you think about it. So if you're going to buy property here, how are you sort of designing the culture to sort of suit your discourse, if I can put it that way? So I would say that it's a great space for a lot of young people to gather and influence the local community, bring them into the discussion so that they sort of self-govern in a sense when it comes to their social cultural politics. Yeah.
So we were looking at tax justice this afternoon and really asking the question about why we pay taxes, who pays taxes, and who benefits from tax. And at the moment, that's quite a complex way to answer it, especially if you just think about South Africa and our tax system in South Africa. It's important because everybody pays tax in South Africa. If you pay a value-added tax, if you get into a taxi, the fuel levy tax, so we all in some way are touched by tax. And it's important that a broad base understands that taxes affect them, and the way in which taxes are used or forgone, as in not collected, affects their ability to have public services, in particular health, education, social development, public transport, water, and energy. So I'm hoping that people understand that they're taxpayers, first and foremost, that there are a few things in life that are certain, death and taxes. And so it's absolutely critical that we pay attention to the ways in which we raise taxes. And it's critical to understand who benefits from that system of raising taxes and how taxes can be of use to you on the ground in relation to access to public services, so the public good. And commoning, really, to recognize that taxes have an impact on the daily lives of everybody, and that includes whether they have roads, whether they have water, whether they have electricity, and so forth. So it has a huge impact on your daily life.
Welcome to this third offering of our 5-part series, conversation series, titled Economy is Care, and asking the question, what if our economy cared for us instead of controlling us? This is a partnership between the New Economy Hub and Oxfam South Africa. This is the third offering of a 5-part conversation series. And we are really trying to explore, what does a caring economy look like? What could it look like? And in a South African context where we've seen, people being marginalized and silenced by policy in the apartheid era, and, by inaccessibility of policy language and, all the things that pushes people's voices to the margin. The hope for this conversation is that everyone's voice matters, and the different languages and, types of talking and of sharing knowledge are honored and, welcomed in this space. And so today, as we grapple with what a kind and caring economy could look like, we are helped in this conversation by the likes of Kopano, the likes of Thoko and her panel, and everybody who's brought this conversation together. And to start us off, I am going to welcome the amazing Kopano, who is a South African performance artist, a writer, an educator, and a cultural worker who's going to give us an amazing poem today that will then allow us to get into the spirit of the conversation. And we invite you to, move along with us, dance with us, in this choreography of dreaming and reimagining our economy. Let's put our hands together for Kopano, please.
Hi, friends. As our lovely MC shared with y'all, my name is Kopano Maroga. I'm a performance artist, I'm a writer, I'm a culture worker, and an educator. And I'm going to be sharing some poems, a little bit from my collection, but a lot from other collections, because I like to think about how to break this culture of auteurship, in arts and cultural production, where we try to kind of like spotlight ourselves and be like, we are the ones with all the ideas and we're so creative and we're so clever. But I am because we are. And there's so many writers and makers that have made me, built me, that I would be remiss not to find a way to bring their voices in an overt way to this space. When it comes to the economy, I don't know if I'm so well-equipped yet. But I did study economics in high school, and I got 98% on the IEB. And when I got this invitation, I was thinking of these, the distinction between economic growth and economic development, right? Where economic growth is looking at the kind of like hard mathematics, the increase of the GDP and the GNP, whereas economic development is looking at social factors that would indicate that an economy is healthy, which is healthcare, which is access to education, which is access to sanitation, right? And thinking about economic development as a more kind of potentially progressive definition for thinking progressively about economics, that then made me think of the domestic, right? And part of that is also because of the etymology of the word economy, which comes from oikonomia, which is Greek, if you couldn't tell. And to further break that down, oikonomia refers to oikos, which means home in Greek, and neimon, which means manage. So it's the management of the home. So domestic affairs, the most kind of granular metric of the economy, are the basis of what economy comes from, right? And so a lot of the work that I write is very domestic, is very internal, is very social and relational. And in that way, I wanted to think about domesticity, interiority, intimacy as a certain kind of understanding or metric of economic development, and that having an understanding of how we are living as different people in this country is integral to building an economy that actually works for all the different people that work in it, perhaps, potentially. So I was on a panel at Open Book, and the moderator asked me to read this poem, and I was like, oh my God, I forgot that I wrote this poem, but thank you for reminding me about it. And it was inspired by a colleague of mine, Christina Johnston, who's a contemporary dance lecturer, academic, researcher. She's based at the University of Pretoria now. And we were working together on a project, a residency project, and she made this comment about how South African dance work tends to centralize or foreground aboutness and representational ideas and politics. And her proposal was this potentially fixes meaning too rigidly in ways that are not necessarily always constructive and productive and can put people into boxes without them realizing that they're doing that to themselves. And I found that a really interesting provocation. So this is inspired by Christina Johnston. It's not so much about what it means, so much as how does it work? Christina Johnston. 1. I am moving past questions of what living means into questions of how living works. Heaven is not a place we can enter without the requisite labor. Heaven is not a place we can enter into upright, but only on our hands and knees. Prayer is divine labor. The meek shall inherit the earth, but only after they are buried in it. Christ carried his cross, and now we must carry everything he has left in his wake. When the living gets too much, I bury myself in the work. Labor is a way not to think about what death means, but to discover how it works. Mortality is the greatest gift that Eve could have ever bestowed unto humanity. Could you imagine if the living would not cease? 2. In 2016, when I was delirious from insomnia and ridden with nameless grief, a thought came to me in my deepest suicidal ideations: the living will end soon enough. Until then, better to see how it works. My aunt passed away. I didn't attend the funeral. I didn't attend to most things. I didn't attend to the work of living with grief because the living would end soon enough. I sometimes think my depression is a story I tell myself to make the living end sooner, how to live in a place where the dead never die. I want to go home and tell my mother that I don't know what that means. I don't know what any of it means. I want to go home and tell my mother that the cross she gave me is hurting my back. I want to go home and tell my mother that she was right. She was always right. And so we no longer need to pretend that we don't know each other anymore. I don't know what that means. I want to make this work. Let's practice makes present. So the next one is from Mantipe Moyela's new collection. She's a new member of the Uhlanga Press family. It's a really beautiful collection about belonging, place, space, fathers, absent fathers. And this is a poem called Faces. On some days, the sky is a mirror I cannot reach. Touching it would be grazing your frail face. The river looks like an ocean, though there are no oceans here, just as there are no fathers. On other days, everything has a face. The clocks, the shoes, bodies of water. I picture yours and my mind dissembles. It gives you frailty. It gifts you a second chance. It surrenders my blank stare at your guarded gate. We are only a stone's deft throw away from a small fracture. 2 stones from splintering a world where you are a man with many faces, many lives, and I am in all of them. Thank you, Mantipe. Okay, but this is hands down my favorite poetry collection of. So I'm sure there are people here who know Mane Mwale. They are a powerhouse, also an Uhlanga human. And this is one of my favorites from them, Litsatsi. In your mother's red gulf, you ask her what Benoni means, son of my sorrow. Hearing the sun instead, you turn the word over in your mind like a coin. Ghosts are living in mind dumps as your mother drives you home. Honeycomb mountains are brittle. Tomorrow you ask her for a crunchy after school. Like all names of the Bible, Benoni sounds ancient. Out your mother's mouth magic, magic. You are still small enough to hide inside the good book's rice paper pages. You do not know yet what you are, have not had Leviticus angled at you like an ice pick. For now, the Bible is a hand drum for women draped in white and blue. Kokatleong, in a pockmarked garage, they are women made of clouds and ocean. They make terrifying sea-wide music. Skobu, the plastic bottom of everything that has a hard shells and bottles on ankles. How neatly old and new gods sit together. In school, you meet a man named Cecil John and learn the word pioneer. Turn the word over in your mind like a coin. Your mother is a witness. Your mother is a pioneer, not yet knocking on doors to tell people about the good news. You wonder if Cecil was a witness too. Wonder on whose doors he knocked, for which God, to spread what good news. Get this collection. I'm thinking a lot these days about this idea of cruel arithmetic. How we can calculate the bodies, the bombs, how the government can count every year how many people will die of exposure on the side of the street. But we cannot make it stop. Thank you so much for spending some time. Please definitely check out the collections of Mano Moale, Mantipo Moila, both are published by Uhlanga Press. You can also find my book as well. All of the proceeds from my book go to the Gala Queer Memory Archive as a way of trying to be, giving back to community. Thank you so much for spending this time with me and being so generous with me. I appreciate it.
Going to welcome our amazing host, Thoko Madonko, who is a leading thinker on issues of economic justice, social justice, climate justice, inequality, and anything that has to do with a just economy, really. She is the person that you go to. She's going to help us today to have a conversation on taxing fairly and spending justly, and what that could look like in the South African context. I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritties of this topic. They are the experts. They will take us through. But I think I'm excited about what alternatives exist for taxing justly, and what spending fairly could look like for South Africa. Thank you so much for agreeing to host this conversation for us, and over to you.
Okay. Thank you so much. And now we are going to be talking about tax. And we use tax in our everyday language in different ways, right? We talk about it's taxing. We talk about black tax. We talk about how one of the most kind of general comments in life is that we say there's very few certainties in life, and that is death and taxes, right? But what is this thing, tax? Why should we be talking about it today? Why should we be thinking about it right now when there are children dying in Gaza, when we have one of the highest unemployment rates in the world in this country, where we see decisions about who gets to live where and how, who has access to affordable housing, who doesn't, all of these big debates. And then you come on a Sunday afternoon to learn about or to discuss tax. So hopefully by the end of this afternoon, we'll have convinced you to pay attention when the next budget gets tabled in February, March, April, May. It can be an open thing, depending on the politics around the budget. But next year, I want you to picture yourselves in Budget 2026 and to pay attention to the tax policy that gets tabled. Because it has huge ramifications for the lives of the majority of South Africans. And yet it gets caught up in very technical language. And I think the Kopano said it beautifully when they said it's kind of a cruelty of calculation, and it gets lost in the numbers, and that is tax as well. So we have a fantastic panel that I have been really honored to be able to bring together in one room, that they're able to, they lead incredibly busy lives, and to be able to get them here I was very excited. So we first have Tanya van Meelis, and she serves as the head of the policy unit and coordinator at the Congress of South African Trade Unions, COSATU. In this capacity, she is responsible for developing and implementing policies related to all sorts of labor issues. And her professional background includes significant experience in economic policy and competition matters. Notably, she has held the position of acting Deputy Director General for the Transformation and Competition Unit at the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition. So additionally, she has served as the chief economist at the Economic Development Department, and she has actively participated on behalf of COSATU at international events, and has a long and prestigious history in the labor movement in South Africa. So thank you so much, Tanya, for joining us today. Our next panelist visitor is Siviwe Mhlana, is a labor market and development economist based at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies at the University of Witwatersrand, where I am based. She is committed to broadening the scope of economic research and policy making through interdisciplinary and decolonial feminist approaches and methodologies. Siviwe has led and collaborated in the implementation of several global research projects, and her recent projects include an investigation of tax justice in the informal economy, and an evaluation of gender in the South African just energy transition, and an African feminist analysis of debt and climate crisis. So she's going to take us through quite a lot of hopefully in terms of what she's been doing. She holds an MA in Social Policy and Labour Studies from Rhodes University, my alma mater, and is currently completing her PhD in the Department of Economics at SOAS University of London. Welcome, Siviwe. And then we have Zimbali Mncube, who is a dedicated social justice activist and researcher with rich experience working with civil society organizations, leading anti-austerity campaigns, and driving policy change. His research has focused on tax and budget policy, social security, and is driven by a passion for fair and human rights-based fiscal policy. And he's just taken on a super new job, so we're really happy to have him here. He's now the head of economic justice at the Friedrich-Stiftung, FES. So welcome, Zimbali. So please give them a round of applause. So it's always important to think of like a good warming up question. I mean, part of me wants to pull out my poetry and start reading my poetry. Sadly, very little of it is written about tax. So I was like trying to think through all my poems, anything on money, and I wasn't coming up with anything. So I'm saving you from my poetry, and I am giving you a warming up question of why does tax justice matter now? In light of South Africa's challenges and global shifts, why should we talk about tax? Tanya.
So if we look at our economy now, we all know the very high levels of unemployment, poverty, inequality. We raise it each year. The problem is that it's getting worse every single year. And we have to say, how do we change this trajectory? One powerful lever to change the trajectory is to look at tax. Who's paying it? Where's it going to? One of the things about tax that I think is so powerful is we always talk about political economy. Who has power in the economy? And because they've got economic power, they have political power. Well, that's so evident in tax. So if you look at tax now, the number of large companies that pay tax, there are 520 odd companies that pay nearly 70% of tax in South Africa. Government, no wonder our government is on a neoliberal trajectory. They bow down to capital because we've got such a concentrated economy that whatever bosses say, government says yes. So for us, if we want to change the future, we have to say, how do we change our economy? How do we change who pays tax? How do we change who spends it? It's not an academic debate. It's a political fight. It's not saying let's take money from here to here. Do you think bosses want to give up their money? Do you think the ultra-rich want to give up their money? Absolutely not. So the struggle is critical now if we're going to change anything in the future.
Thanks, Tanya. So the bosses are not going to do it. Siviwe, why should we talk about tax?
Well, first of all, thanks, Thoko, for such a generous introduction. And especially to Kopano, who I don't see right now, I think, especially for grounding this conversation, it is poetry, but I think what was demonstrated just a bit before our conversation is how economic issues are experienced on the ground. And I think for the most part, and this is why we should be talking about taxes as well, because it speaks to how we directly interact with the economy. There's a lot of conversations that are happening now in the international space, particularly coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic, where governments have, committed to many loans with the IFIs and the conditionalities that have been attached to that. There's a conversation, of course, on the debt side, and I believe that you've had previous dialogues that have touched on this topic. But also coming up is the UN Tax Convention as well. I think a lot of the times we have these as completely separate conversations, right? We'll have the conversations of kind of macro level, kind of global policy issues. And then we want to say, oh, well, we can't be talking about tax. We can't be talking about VAT as part of these global conversations because, this is only speaking to kind of the global policy space. The legal frameworks are different. We're not talking about indirect taxes. But I think we'll show from this conversation how these are connected. And in light of the poetry that we was shared with us today, how this actually impacts our everyday lives. I think it's great to be having this conversation. I haven't really seen many discussions about tax actually in the South African policy space or even in academia, even though it impacts us so deeply and profoundly, and I'm hoping to unpack that.
Yeah. Thanks so much. Zimbali, your take on why we should be talking about tax.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. And this is a lovely space and I'm super excited to contribute to it. I think for me, it's to add on what the panelists have said. It's quite an important topic given that we're seeing globally how technology, what is now termed 4IR and so on, is reshaping or accelerating globalization. And I think with that has come the increasing flow of monies, people, goods and services. And to a certain extent, that has led to accumulation of wealth by only a few, which Tanya has touched on. And we're seeing this happening through the existing loopholes that are in the international tax system in particular, and to a certain extent in our domestic tax systems. And so those loopholes are being used by companies that are now operating globally, not just in one jurisdiction. And this is, as we've seen, harming the potential revenue that countries could raise if they were to close these loopholes. And I think for a long time, as Siviwe has said, the international tax system has been broken and hasn't been fit for purpose. We've seen the OECD, the Organization for, I think, Economic Development, something like that. It's been the rich club of countries that has basically set the tone for who is taxed, how they are taxed, and so on. And that hasn't been at an equal footing to the global south, particularly developing countries like ours. And so we've been invited to this table, but we haven't necessarily played a role in shaping how countries, companies that are operating in our territories are being taxed. And so with the recent UN Tax Convention, I think we're beginning to see those conversations emerge. And so over and above the high unemployment rate we have, over 12 million people being unemployed, and the excessive profits that these companies are making, we should see, like Tanya has said, tax as one of the tools to redistribute income, particularly wealth that has been amassed through exploitation, through historical injustices such as colonialism and apartheid. And so tax can play a role in addressing some of those issues. And, it's quite urgent for us. I think in South Africa, we saw the budget was postponed like 3 times now because of the proposal to hike VAT and the lack of considerations of other progressive measures to raise revenue. And so that in and of itself has sparked the debate around who bears the burden in terms of the revenues we raise, and to a certain extent, how are they used to fulfill our social and economic priorities.
So, I mean, essentially, one of the core kind of components around a conversation about tax is that it goes to the heart of what it means to live the good life. Essentially, what kind of society do we want? What kind of decisions do we want to make about the resources we use within our country and our economy, and how those resources get distributed? And often that's overlooked. So we could have a minister quite confidently get up in a public setting and say he woke up one morning and decided to hike VAT, because there was no scrutiny, there was no public engagement of the mass kind that we saw in Kenya, actually, in relation to hiking. Or some people say it was avoided because that was never tabled, the VAT decision. But VAT has a real body impact in terms of what you can eat and what you can't eat, and also being told what you can and cannot eat in terms of the zero rating of goods. So this conversation is really important about who pays tax and who benefits from tax, and what are the class interests. And so to put on my old Marxist hat, let's talk about class interests around who benefits and who doesn't from the provision of services. So it's also about thinking about the ideal society that we want to have, and what does this economy look like where we have a highly provided for society. What role then does taxation play? So thinking through that in the South African context, Tanya, how has Labour engaged with tax justice in South Africa? And where are the tensions and opportunities?
Okay. So Labour has engaged traditionally on the budget every year. So in the run-up to the budget, discussions in October about the medium-term budget statement that's coming out. We've been doing it on an ongoing basis. What we've started pushing more now is to look at it at an international level. What are the key things that we want out of it? Well, the one thing is to say, and it comes back to exactly to what you were saying, how are ordinary people's lives affected? We live now with 55% of the population lives below the upper bound poverty line, right? That means you're barely managing to eat nutritious meals, and you're barely managing to buy soap, clothes, anything like that. Now, how can we say that we've got a just society when over half of our population cannot make ends meet, where children are stunted and not growing because they're not getting food? And yet you get the ultra wealthy now driving around in the most imported cars with not a care in the world. If we look at the budget over the last few years, with austerity kicking in, so government has been saying, let's prioritize paying the loans back. That's the most important thing. What they say at the same time, which is really misrepresenting the facts, is they say, well, don't worry, 60% of the budget goes to the social wage. What they're not saying is that it's 60% of the budget after they've paid interest. So they're prioritizing paying the financial institutions, which are making money hand over fist. You see what the CEOs are earning, 80 million a year before bonuses even, and leaving people on the ground pretending that they're paying. Don't worry, we've got a childcare grant. Well, what can you do with 370 Rand a month? So the priorities are to say, let's rejig where we're spending our money. Let's take out less loans, less dollar-denominated loans. If we owe money, we owe money. We can pay it back, but there must also be debt justice. And I know that's not the discussion here, but it is important, because why should we be paying more money on debt when in fact the money that we get should be paid on social development, but also on building economic infrastructure that is going to grow jobs. So the money now, and I'm going to finish in 1 second, is going towards building ports for exports. Well, thanks very much. When we don't have water running, where we're getting constant power outages to save electricity, people's lives matter. Human capital, what we are, what we can bring, not only to our lives, but to the economy matters, and you need to invest in that as the priority.
And so tax is also about redistribution. It's not just about, sort of taking from the rich. It's about saying the rich didn't just wake up one morning having made their wealth because they're entrepreneurial, these myths around being rich. No, you breathe the same air, you drive on the same roads, you drink the same water, it's the same land. And so the idea is that you cannot have that kind of amassing of wealth. So there should be a level of redistribution to be able to say, these services matter: education, health, public transport, water provisioning, energy provisioning, all of that. As an ideal society, a good society should be publicly provided. And that's kind of what tax should be. We should think about tax as a redistributive element as well. But having said that, it's important to think about the kinds of tensions that have been played out in the narrative around taxation in South Africa. And I was recently at an event where I was asked, no, but the informal sector doesn't pay tax, right? And so we should tax the informal sector. That's part of our problem. We're not taxing the informal sector. And sometimes it comes with a very xenophobic bias to it as well, because they want to tax the Pakistanis or the Ethiopians as if they're not paying VAT when they purchase goods, as if they're not paying tax when they engage economically in their communities and environments. So this question about where the tax comes from is quite interesting. So we have personal income tax, which is based on your salaries, if you're lucky enough to earn a salary in this country. It's corporate income tax. Tanya talked about the companies. And then we have the indirect taxes, which is the value-added tax, and your fuel levies, your sin taxes, your sugar tax, the health levy. Those are the various, and plus some component around the way in which tariffs, which has been a big story with Trump recently. That's a form of tax. So, but there's also revenue foregone. So there are ways in which we say, we're not going to tax you because if you engage in these activities, we will benefit economically. So we have what are called tax breaks or tax credits, which the famous ones is the medical aid tax credit. If you have a medical aid in this country, you get money back. If you pay a percentage of your pension, again, if you're lucky enough, you get tax back. So there's all these mechanisms. There's the youth employment tax incentive, which is supposed to incentivize companies, which costs billions of rands to our economy. So it's also about revenue foregone. So in the work that I've done over the years, the discussion around expenditure of the budget and how the budget is spent. And so we hear a lot about corruption, maladministration, but it's right that we very rarely hear about the revenue side. And that has been a political decision. And part of that political decision is that we have moved away over the last 30 years in South Africa, but globally, from taxing wealth and taxing the rich and taxing industries. We've reduced our corporate income tax rate. We've reduced the way in which we tax wealth in this country, and we've decided to borrow. So the discussion, if you were here for the debt discussion last week or whenever it was, is that we have decided to borrow as opposed to tax. So it is no coincidence that we see an increase in our debt repayments and a decrease in our tax collection. And we are decided that we're going to use the resources through value-added tax, you must know, to ensure that the creditors, who are the ultra-wealthy saver investors, get their money. That's essentially the policy that this country is following. But having said that, we want to now tax the informal sector, which is a global phenomenon, but is being discussed seriously in South Africa. Siviwe, can you tell us a little bit about what are the emerging debates and issues about taxing the informal sector? And are there any gendered issues that we should keep in mind when we're talking about taxing the informal sector?
Thanks, Thoko. And thank you for actually grounding my response to your question, particularly in regards to this question of debt and how our kind of priorities are determined by kind of international financial institutions and the conditionalities that are attached to that. So to speak to this issue in particular with the informal economy, and I think having kind of already mentioned what happened with the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of governments were in this crisis, to, of course, increase revenues. But the broader discussion around the informal economy was that, the way that we can do this and increase our revenues is through the informal sector, this hidden gold mine that is alleged by a lot of kind of policy makers in the space. From the South African side, the conversation about the informal sector tends to be a bit different. It is believed that South Africa's informal sector is much smaller compared to regional estimates, but I will argue that a lot of the studies that have gone into kind of measuring this is something about around 20%. I haven't checked the stats on this recently for South Africa. But a lot of this is because a lot of the studies have kind of focused on traditional informal sectors, right? So your market traders, your home-based workers, your domestic workers, etc. But South Africa's informality, if we look at kind of the expanded definitions by the ICLS, would also be considered informal, to have much larger informal economy than previously kind of estimated, mainly because a lot of the work that is considered to be in traditionally formal sectors in the South African sense is, for the most part, casualized, non-standard, and precarious work. And so to this question about, I think you raised two questions here about, why do we pay taxes? Who is paying taxes, maybe three questions, but also who benefits, right? So how do we allocate our budgets in ways that actually benefit the majority of the population? So when we speak both in the South African sense and or even in the context of African economies, people that are in the informal sector, both in kind of traditionally informal sectors, but also in the kind of broad-based, employment-based definitions of informality, are people that kind of fall in this kind of middle ground of in both not being able to kind of benefit from social protections and social protections through the job, but also likely to miss out on kind of social services that are being provided by the state. So with the COVID-19 pandemic, it was assumed that, there's a lot of people that are benefiting from the kind of cash transfers or measures of relief that governments are putting in place. But the reality, and as colleagues from the Research and Advocacy Network, Women in Informal Employment, Globalizing and Organizing have shown that this is not necessarily the case. Because as I mentioned, these are people that do not have entitlements through their job, but based on whatever they're earning, they're still not able to access social protection and social services through the state. But also to this assumption of hidden gold mine. Having worked on the informal sector, we know that these are also jobs that are, for the most part, insecure, but also people that are earning low wages. But our governments, again, will prioritize increasing revenues by targeting the most vulnerable, rather than looking to kind of the top end of the spectrum. And to your question then about what are the gender implications of this? I've been doing some work in Ghana and Tanzania, also in Ecuador and Colombia, on tax justice in the informal economy. And at least in the Ghana case, we did a project that was evaluating a survey of 2,700 workers in the informal economy. And this was coming out, I guess, of the COVID-19 pandemic and lockdown period around 2022. And again, to this discussion, it's always said, informal workers are not contributing to taxes, right? Because of course we said these are low income earners. And so, of course, they might be exempt from paying taxes in the kind of income sense. But we broadened this definition, right? In terms of payments and fees that the informal sector is having to contribute in order to operate in the space. So we expanded the definition to look at things like the daily toll, stamp duties, business registration. So it was, yes, both in the sense of kind of taxes in the kind of formal traditional sense, but also in terms of fees that are usually paid to both, I guess, with stamp duties to revenue authorities, but also to the metropolitan assemblies and municipal assemblies, local kind of taxes, right? And we found that, well, it's actually not true that informal workers don't pay taxes. They actually do pay taxes, and they are entitled to certain benefits that they're still not receiving, right? So if you go into the marketplace in Accra, you'll find that informal workers, while they are paying daily tolls or business registrations, do not have access to water, do not have access to electricity, and yet they're still paying this. And this has significant gendered impacts. So when policymakers are recommending, oh no, let's increase tax, we're not taxing the informal sector optimally, let's increase taxes for the informal sector, or even let's increase VAT for the informal sector, we kind of evaluated what the implications of that would be. Now, at the lower end, we're looking at workers who, in the Ghana sense, are earning less than 200 cedis a month, and that's like, I think, 196 cedis to be more accurate with this sample in particular. And the highest end, and this is the hidden gold mine that people are talking about, earning still under 4,000 cedis a month. And what does that mean then as well in terms of being able to survive, right? So if people are having to both sustain and maintain their businesses, but they're also through their activities in the informal sector supposed to maintain their livelihoods, who is most impacted? If you're not getting access to, as I said, social protections and social services, you don't have a medical aid, but you're also not able to access healthcare through the state, who is bearing the brunt of this? And so feminists have kind of done this work. And I've argued for years, that at the end of the day, and we saw this with the COVID-19 pandemic as well, that women end up being kind of the cushions and shock absorbers in times of crisis. But this has significant implications and costs, right? Both in their ability to earn an income, in their ability to participate in the labor market, but also severe kind of social and health implications as well. So there's another study that we did with WeGo several years ago that was looking at the cost of a lack of and inadequate access to social protections and social services amongst domestic workers in South Asia. And there's always a decision then. If you're not able, if your child is sick or you are sick, there's specific direct and indirect costs of that. So we found that workers were either delaying their own health needs because they were not able to miss work because no work, no pay. But also in the case that, a child or a family or elder dependent was sick or having, to be cared for, they were the ones that were having to kind of withdraw. And it's the same case even in the South African case where I've done work on the kind of the automotive sector. Women were the ones through these kind of casual and non-standard work and insecure jobs with no protections. They were the ones that were more likely to kind of withdraw from the labor market. And so, in a sense, kind of sacrificing even the low wages that they were earning in the first place. So I think it is important to kind of think about these questions that you've raised about, who are we taxing, but also why are we taxing? So if are taxes supposed to be going towards debt servicing, or are they supposed to be kind of responding to the priorities and needs of development within our kind of national context? And so we would tax differently if we considered these issues, which would also have some significant gendered implications. But I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks. So, I mean, the interesting thing is that the attention is paid is beginning, this kind of demand for greater indirect taxes is the move globally. And then also to start trying to ensure that they get access to resources from the least able to, or those that can't really afford to be paying because they're paying anyway in different ways. Again, these kind of indirect taxes. And so there are a number of myths that float around when we talk about tax. One of them is, and I can ask you, do you all pay tax? Now, you'll be amazed at how many talks I go to where I ask that question and I say, do you pay tax? And the number of people who will say no. Because it is so strongly communicated in the media that we have this thing called a narrow tax base. But if you buy anything, a sweet, pay your cell phone bill, have a funeral policy, which is the majority of South Africans have a funeral policy, you're paying value-added tax. You are a taxpayer. So if there's anything you take away from this afternoon is to please go and share that news with everyone and anyone that you know, because it's completely misleading that we have this incredibly narrow tax base. We don't. We have an incredibly broad tax base. What they have decided is to pay attention to income tax and who is paying income tax. And then it's even further misleading because you don't know the nature of that income, the range, the multi-millionaires that we have in this country. That pay less tax because of tax dodging and tax avoidance. They do all sorts of things. They create trusts in which they put all their wealth and hide and then don't. I mean, it's unbelievable, the kind of nature of tax evasion and avoidance. Some of it's legal, it's morally problematic, but it's not illegal, and some of it is illegal. They're just whittling away their wealth in tax and tax havens and so forth. So this brings me to the conversation about if we are to understand our local tax environment, we can't seem to really understand it without understanding some of the myths, which is if we tax the rich anymore, they'll just leave. They won't pay. If we tax these companies more, they will up and go. And that's a myth. There's no evidence that that's, there was a little bit from SARS saying that when they did increase something, there was a little bit of a blip, but nothing negligible. So Zimbali, I'm going to ask you two questions. One of them is a wild card one because I've thrown it in there. Who do you think resists tax justice the most? And which international tax justice struggles or reforms should we be paying attention to and why?
I'm going to start with the last one because it's more like clear-cut than the first one. But I think the most important development, we've touched on it a bit, the UN Tax Convention is basically an international treaty that will, for the first time in a long time, create an equal footing for all countries to negotiate about their tax revenues, how they are raised, where they are raised, and so on. And so I think it's quite historical to emphasize its development. But it's also important to unpack a bit what does it mean, for globally, but also for countries in particular. And I think there are many ways to think about the potential gains we can get from it without even preempting that it will be, progressive and so on, because there are blockers that are still shaping and influencing the process. But there are three key benefits that I would like to highlight, which I think we should all be aware of. And the first one is that a framework convention or international tax convention will allow us to have a comprehensive measure for us to understand the extent of ownership of assets across countries. It will allow countries to have automatic exchange of information, and it will allow us to start to develop publicly available registers about ownership of assets and country-by-country reporting of these assets. And I think it will also allow for countries to share knowledge and information amongst one another to, improve their capacities. And I think we are seeing this, that these conversations, as they continue to happen, the negotiation started last year. The third round is coming in November in Kenya. But I think one critical issue is that, these are issues we should all care about, but these are issues that our government should also care about, because these negotiations, although civil society has a say in terms of transparency and public accountability, our government is missing, particularly the National Treasury in South Africa is missing in this conversation. And one could say it's because of the G20 and other issues, but I think looking at the domestic development in the tech space, I would say it's more of a political question and a lack of willingness to actually play a proactive role, and which is quite unfortunate, because where we are with the international tax development, the Africa group led by Nigeria, through, relentless work by civil society, is the one that sort of contributed to where the international conversations are at the moment. And so to see one of, the most developed countries in Africa, in quotes, not playing their role, particularly also pushing a regressive side of the tax book in the OECD sort of two-pillar proposals to reconfigure the international system is worrying. And I think that speaks to the domestic question as well. Who is not playing the second part of the question? Who is most resisting, and we've been fighting a lot with the finance ministry in particular to say that we should be playing a much more proactive role in ensuring that we tax fairly and ensuring that those who can pay the fair share of taxes do so. And yeah, like Tanya said, I think it's more of a political question than a technical question, because these international debates are feeding into the domestic sort of dynamics. Recently South Africa has also joined the Seville platform for taxing the super rich, which was initiated by Brazil and Spain in the context of the recent UN Financing for Development conference. Even then, we're seeing that the presidency has endorsed this proposal. However, domestically, that sort of ambition is not being met by, any pronouncement to, for instance, work towards any proposal, really. I don't want to push a certain agenda, but like progressive forms of taxes, so to put it, despite the overwhelming, I think, momentum that is being gained in the international scene at the moment. And I think that sort of disjuncture is one that also speaks to maybe our lack of organization in the civil society space to ensure that, and to borrow Russell's term, our narratives are finding expression across, society. We are seeing the media is playing, to a certain extent, reproducing some of the myths that we are cautioning people against. But I think we should play a proactive role in also ensuring that we call our colleagues in the media space and saying, these are the facts, and this is how to better report on them, right? And that's how you begin to win the debate, even, in society, because I think we shouldn't take it for granted that everyone is in favor of some of the progressive measures that we are proposing, but there's still a debate, in civil society and broadly in society, that I think we should take advantage of the developments that we are seeing in the international space. And the key moment that is the G20, which is, in 2 months' time, the lead all of the leaders of these rich countries will be in South Africa. And we saw how Brazil used that moment to say, perhaps we should, tax 2% of the global billionaires, and that we can, at least start raising revenue up to 250 billion, US dollars. And whether or not one agrees with that proposal, there is a debate of, how we'll actually actualize it. And I don't want to go into it now, but it's to say that that was an example of how the moment of the G20 or international moments where the country was looking at, Brazil, and they sparked, a debate to say we should start, speaking about this. And the technical work is starting to be, built up. Now we need the political players to also play their role, including ourselves as civil society. So the second part of your question is a bit complex. Although I can name and say it's National Treasury, but in the general public, if you can ask in the audience now, we're not all on the same page, right? And that in itself is part of the problem that I think we need to work towards.
So, I mean, it's very interesting because there's a huge debate that is raging on about whether or not it's politically viable anymore, given what happened this year in the budget process to talk about raising taxes. And I have one colleague who kind of feels that ship has sailed. We can't touch on taxes, which is very interesting because the New Economy Hub did some amazing work last year. This year, sorry. This year has been a long year. Earlier this year, looking at the sort of people's willingness to pay taxes. And there is actually a very high, at least in this study, there was a very positive, yes, we're happy to pay taxes as long as we get services. So part of the dynamic is putting the public back into tax, almost, if I could put it that way. And so it's often talked about in this kind of tax the rich, but for what, right? And people are going, well, if you're going to tax the rich, and it's just going to go towards corruption, what's the purpose? Whereas SARS, the South African Revenue Service, is saying, give us the money and we will tax the rich, the tax dodgers. We just need the capacity. We don't have the capacity. You don't actually need to raise taxes. You just need us to give us the ability to get those that are avoiding and dodging their taxes through all sorts of various mechanisms, which I thought was very interesting. So there was this very strong push by our own revenue service to say, no, VAT is not necessary because just give us the powers and we'll raise the money that you're talking about. So you don't have to hit the poor one-headed household, women households in our communities who now have to pay more for food, because we've upped that. Unfortunately, Treasury was so sneaky that they did it through the fuel levy, which I think was a brilliant, genius move that I didn't even see coming because it's so dependent now on the cost of fuel. So they're going to raise more if the fuel price goes up. They're going to raise more money as a result of the fuel levy tax than they would have if they had just done the value-added tax rate. So it's a genius move. So we have to pay attention to how they are making these decisions and on what basis and who gets affected. So if we're trying to put the public back into tax, how would you each, this is to all of you, reimagine South Africa's tax system through the lens of justice? What would it look like? What would it feel like? What would it smell like? What would it taste like? What would be a tax-just future for South Africa? I will start with Zimbali and then work backwards.
Yeah. No, for me, I don't think we have to stretch our imagination that far, because there are tools that are there for us to at least use to start building the principles and the building blocks of a just tax system. And one of those tools is the International Covenant of Economic and Cultural Rights, and social rights, apologies. And it has specific principles that we have to abide by, which we are year in, year out failing to even uphold those principles, and they include ensuring that there are progressive measures taken to raise maximum available resources. They include not regressing on basic rights that the government has ensured. They also include principles of inclusiveness and democratic participation. Now, if one minister can wake up and say VAT is now 50% or whatever, then clearly we are failing as a country to even achieve the bare minimum, which is to start to open up the fiscal policy space or the budget space to public scrutiny, but also public participation. It's not just about coming and say, oh, austerity, austerity, but we should be, and I mean all of us, by we, be playing a key role in ensuring that we, shape our tax systems, right? It's also about transparency and non-discrimination, which I also feel these are measures that they seem very simple and mundane, but we actually do not know how budget process is crafted. We know the institutions, we know the steps that are followed, but we find out, like everyone else, including the governing party, we've learned recently that a week or so before, they only presented with the budget then. And so, I should have said the former governing party, because we're in the GNU moment now. But that clearly demonstrates that the National Treasury still has a strong hold on how we determine our not just tax policy, but our broad budget policy and our fiscal strategy as a whole, how we raise debt, who we borrow from, what are the conditions under which we borrow. We are just hearing that, we've signed a loan, and the implications of that loan speak directly to the tax revenue and the tax policies we pursue. As you've touched on, the government has chosen to the debt side of issues and to pay debt as opposed to raising taxes. And so I think for me, those are some of the basic principles that one does not need to necessarily invent something that is entirely new, but we need to ensure that we get them right, as a starting point. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks, Thoko and Zimbali for starting the responses for us on such a big question. What would a tax-just South Africa look like? I think for me, I've been going around lately speaking on different issues and trying to, of course, approach it through a decolonial African feminist lens. And it's true, as Zimbali says, a lot of the things are there, right? And maybe, it can be argued that, we don't need new policies or frameworks or things like that. I will say, however, though, there is obviously that part where you can argue that maybe the issue is about accountability and maybe creating the tools for that kind of accountability. But I also think that the way that we have kind of imagined our economy so far has still been with this kind of, white, Eurocentric, patriarchal, capitalist lens. And maybe there is something about that then that speaks to this question about how do we tax and who do we prioritize. And so if we think about it that way, that in a sense that the economy that we're working with and the kind of tax frameworks that we're kind of working with are not exactly we're not designed to benefit the majority of the people and the poor in South Africa, but also on the African continent. And maybe there is a question then about building a counter narrative for that. One that recognizes the history of development on the continent, but also our engagement with a lot of these corporations that we're talking about. That all of this really has been kind of the process of development, which has been led by systems of oppression, exploitation, dispossession, and how do we then kind of bring that back with a tax system that recognizes these issues? So then from an African feminist perspective then, and even though many people will say, okay, well, what exactly is that? There's been a lot of work that people have been doing, kind of feminist political economists on the continent, but also I think the kind of entire decolonial school. It is about really trying to kind of prioritize the things that our understanding. I think we started this conversation about development that Kopano mentioned, right? What is growth and what is development? And thank you for that. That really our understanding of development, which I think people like Wangari Maathai and Vandana Shiva in the Indian sense have argued that the economy that we have been told is development is actually maldevelopment. But development in the African sense is one that actually prioritizes the very things that we've been talking about, right? That progress historically in our sense and in our context has been about, sharing resources, has been about kind of protecting livelihoods and ensuring that. And so our tax framework should really be reflective of that, right? What is it that we're prioritizing? And so really to conclude then, I would say prioritizing kind of the national development priorities. We know that in the South African sense, as Tanya mentioned, that we have high unemployment and inequality, and what does that mean in that sense for survival? But also, I think if we recognize, as I said, the kind of the history of colonialism and capitalist expansion on the continent, but also in the South African sense, then we might also then consider, well, if our tax system is really being run by the kind of IMF conditionalities and what's been kind of happening with the kind of international financial institutions and in the global space, how then do we kind of restructure our kind of debt responsibilities in a way that helps us then in kind of developing a new framework for the tax issue? Because as it was mentioned, a lot of the kind of revenue and that is collected is actually going towards tax debt servicing. But also thinking about our economies kind of even before the kind of colonialism and colonial history that we like to talk about, and we say, oh, we're in all of these problems because of this. Thinking about our economies and the history of our own development outside of this. I've been speaking to a feminist on the continent about, how would we understand the challenges of Africa, even the challenges of South Africa outside of this kind of white Western theories, right? And that is to say that, before colonialism, our distribution of work was understood differently. What we understood as productive and unproductive labor was understood differently. And that this language of kind of separating value and understanding value in this way, and also deciding who not to tax and who gets to get exemptions in this way, is also based on that. So kind of valuing unpaid and informal work, it should be a priority to this as well. But also prioritizing gender justice and kind of social well-being and human rights should reflect that. But to this conversation that Zimbali is having about the UN Tax Convention, a lot of people are going to say, well, this has nothing to do with the tax. And I think that our demands then, and if our governments participate in this kind of negotiation process, should actually be centering this, because this is what is actually holding us back and our development priorities back in that sense. And that should be in the convention. If we're having a convention about tax, it shouldn't just be about who to tax and not to tax, but why we tax and who benefits from that. I think that would then recenter kind of our priorities in that way, in a way that I think would be kind of a path towards justice in a way that we haven't seen so far. But I'll stop there. Thanks.
So some provocations. Can we have tax justice under capitalism? Or do we need to be deeply anti-capitalist to have a just system of living in the world? Tanya, over to you.
Kasatu believes that we should be pursuing socialism and all our activities now must lead to socialism. Amandla. But I agree very much with what's said here, and I want to add on that spirit just a little bit of a radical twist. The space has opened up for us to contest, and it's opened up for us to contest because we've been contesting, because we've brought class struggle to the fore. But it's at a ridiculous level. So if you look at what SARS pursues as taxing the ultra-wealthy, to be considered ultra-wealthy, you have to have 30 million in your pocket, right? Now, if you were earning a national minimum wage now, it would only take you 500,000 years to get to 30 million, assuming that you never spent a cent of what you earn. This is ridiculous. How can you say ultra-wealthy is 30 million? Ultra-wealthy is 10 million. That's already huge wealth. That's money that most people in South Africa could never assume, could never see in their lives of their children, grandchildren, and 10 generations down. So we need to push much harder and challenge who is the ultra-wealthy that we want to tax. The second thing is that we need to close the loophole. So I agree with what's been said, but I just want to give a practical example. When we import a suit from China, and I'm making up the numbers now, I don't remember them offhand, China will say, we are exporting the suit for 2,000 Rand. They land on South Africa's shores showing that we're importing it for 200 Rand. That's under invoicing. That's illegal. But what it means is if you're paying customs duties, you're now paying customs duties on 200 Rand, not 2,000 Rand. That nonsense must stop. We need the international tax agreements to make sure that there's the sharing of information. It's not even saying if you're rich, tax. It's saying if you're a crook, pay your tax, whether you're rich or whether you're poor. Importers and all the dodging must stop. The last thing I just want to bring about, what would tax justice look like? Because we talk about where money is going, but I want to just show how it affects the daily lives. If you look at nurses in South Africa now, so we know per capita spending on health has been declining. I've spoken to members of Nahawu, I see a comrade there, who will say, we want to do our jobs, but the number of nurses who are employed are less. We're running between more and more hospital beds. We want to give the medicine. There isn't always the medicine. They frazzled. They exhausted. They worked to the bone. What do I want to see for tax justice? I want to see more public servants able to deliver the services that people want and need when they pay their tax. Not people being exploited, whether you're a public sector worker or whether you're an informal sector worker with no protection. I want people to have dignity in their jobs, to earn not only a minimum wage, but living wages and better. They'll pay tax. You said it. But also then lead decent lives as workers and know that when you go with your grannies, with your cousins, with your family to get public services, the teachers, the nurses, the municipal workers have the person power and the resources to give you what you need as well.
Yeah. So it's not only sort of putting the public back, it's putting people back into tax, right? So it becomes an important point. Thank you so much. So on that note, I want to open up the question to you as the audience. If we were to reimagine South Africa's tax system through the lens of justice, what would it look like to you? So I'd be curious to hear. And any other questions you might have.
Thank you very much for a very interesting conversation. I think I won't be able to answer that question you asked, but I'd rather ask a question. I've always wondered whether politicians, I'm talking about members of parliament, in both houses, I mean, we've got 400 in the National Assembly and 90 who constitute the provincial, that other house. and also we have legislatures, provincial legislatures. Do they pay taxes, these guys?
I'll abuse my position as the chair and say, yes, the MPs do pay their taxes, assuming that they're not engaging in, well, they'll pay tax either way, but they're in an income bracket where they're able to reduce or their kind of effective tax rates compared to other people who earn less. So they're in an earning bracket, they earn enough to be able to play some of the tax games that the rest of us aren't able to play.
Thank you so much for the really engaging and enriching panel. On the question of accountability and what a just taxing system and just economic system would look like, I'd like to throw us back a little bit and ask the question on wealth tax and corporate tax, especially. Something that I was surprised to find out coming from a legal kind of space is that notwithstanding the limitations of the TRC, and notwithstanding the business and labor talks being outside of the scope of the TRC, there was actually a recommendation on a corporate tax on the basis that all corporations, even those with almost directly bloody hands, but even those simply implicated in the system, should be paying tax because they benefited from apartheid and by implication, arguably colonialism, right? Looking at the Dutch East India Company and beyond. And it feels so much that the kind of neoliberal speak, as much as that's become tropey, has forced us into a binary where even conversations around basic tax seem to be posed as radical or constructed as radical. So I just wanted to ask the question, and apologies for the kind of the long lead up. The question on the place of tax in reparations and redistributions and corporate tax by virtue of benefit and wealth that has not been traced, if not only redistributed since apartheid and colonialism. Is that part of the conversation? Should it be? What is the scope for that? If you have any thoughts on that, I'd be grateful.
And I just have to note that it's been bugging me because behind Zimbali is a book called The History of Inequality in South Africa from 1652 to 2002 by Saint-Peter Blanche. And just as an anecdote, he, as part of the lead up to the negotiations to 1994, he suggested that South Africa implement a solidarity tax of about 3% on wealth for 5 years. It was limited. It was like a limited period, and it was meant to be a kind of solidarity tax that would, at that time, have hit the majority very wealthy white population in the country that benefited from apartheid, and would have hit at an economic level to enable the average white South African, well, no, above average, because we're talking wealth, so wealthy, above average, wealthy white South African, to understand that they benefited from colonialism and apartheid. It was shut down, like it went nowhere. But it's an old proposal. So even talking about wealth taxes is not a new conversation. It's a relatively old conversation.
I mean, I think it's fascinating what you raise, and I have to say I hadn't thought about it for a while. So Kasatu's been saying we want a 2% wealth tax, but I think when we've been thinking of that, we've been thinking of it broadly without saying what additionality in terms of reparations. What you raise is something that I think is really strong idea. I don't know how it's gotten lost along the way a little bit. And certainly I thank you for raising it because I'm going to go back and look at that seriously. I don't have the answer right now, but thank you for the wake up on that.
So I think the space is opening up, I think, to kind of confront the history more directly. I think there's still a lot of work. And as to the question of what can be done, to actually foreground this in the kind of policy and movement space. As I mentioned, I haven't been part of kind of discussions in this way, which I do believe, as much as I see many kind of experts and academics in the room, is about kind of mobilizing the public around these issues so that we're able to kind of resist and coordinate. I think most urgently and kind of pressing is the question of the UN tax. Tax Convention, which I was just checking my phone, I wasn't texting, is actually on the I think on the 10th to the 21st of November is the UN Tax Convention in Nairobi, where governments and civil society will be speaking to kind of the issues of tax and kind of rethinking the existing tax framework to be more just and equitable, particularly for developing countries. It is our duty, I think, and our democratic responsibility to engage with our politicians and policymakers, with Treasury, and to hold them accountable. So as much as we might not have the kind of tools for accountability in terms of the tax framework and the legal language there, our politicians are kind of responsible and essentially are supposed to be answering and representing kind of the needs of the constituents. So yes, as civil society, I think there's been a lot of criticism about the South African left over the years, but it is time to kind of coordinate and work with each other. And I think tax is one of the kind of issues that can bring us to that. So yes, work with your kind of organization, civil society. Civil society does tend to have a space. If you know someone that is able to speak, who's going to be holding a microphone at these negotiations, speak to them, put in kind of your demands as well, and make sure that kind of the discussion that we're having is represented in this space. But also the South African government needs to know that this is a priority. There's a lot of criticism actually about South Africa on the rest of the continent, particularly in the Pan-African space, about how we don't even care about issues that are being raised by, even in this conversation about the UN Tax Convention, but even African Union. What is it that we're doing? That they will rather fly to meetings for the G20 than they will to respond to kind of meetings for the African Union. So our government needs to know that these are issues that we're taking seriously, and that we expect for our kind of views to be represented in that.
It's very interesting and enlightening conversation. I particularly enjoyed the sections around the informal taxations in Accra, Ghana. That's really fascinating, and I'd love to read more on that. But I'm coming really to sort of disturb really the boundaries and the borders in which we're operating around issues of tax, because we understand right now that tax evasions, tax havens come as a direct result of the language that we use around taxations. And maybe if they're policymakers in the space, they can maybe enlighten us around how is it that there are technical wordings that allow for people. It's so frustrating because I'm right now, I mean, even from the poetry, we got to understand that language frees us and it simultaneously will imprison us. And it seems that our issue fundamentally with tax and on policy around tax is in the language. And I'm trying to bring, in a sense, this sort of decolonial movement that's been moving in the varsity spaces, even in this dimension, to say, perhaps we really need to Ubuntu-fy the way we're speaking around tax and really break it down, because it's in a niche, it's so expectee that it's kind of hard that a lot of people say, I don't pay tax, but you do, and why are we taxing certain things in a different way than to others? So that's just my food for thought for the room. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
Mine is simple, comrades. We the 99 is happening at Cornhill. If you've not been part of these conversations, come and join us. That will be a space where we start to iron out some of these issues, have practical, questions answered and opportunities to teach each other and, use decolonial language to start to unpack these questions. And so that is the starting point, like practically. And shout out to the guys that are behind this and part of the working groups. People must join and we can start working collectively, because I think for me that is part of the question, is that we haven't found the language and it speaks to the point that has been raised to communicate some of these issues. And I think the starting point is to create spaces where we convene collectively and we start, helping each other to shape some of our proposals. And I think it's interesting that you mentioned Uber and Meta and the likes, because it's actually the first protocol that is being negotiated at the UN Tax Convention, and our voices need to find expression, and that's why it's quite important for us to actually make demands to the government, but also to start to, amongst each other, to demystify these topics. And yeah, I support taxing the wealthy and reparations. But I just also have questions like Tanya about the policy implications, given the quite limited, due to austerity capacity that SARS has in, administering some of the taxes that we are proposing, such as the wealth tax. There's quite a limited number of people within the unit that are starting to uncover some of the, questions on ownership in domestic and foreign assets. And so I think we should essentially see the question of tax as not a silver bullet, but as one of the questions or the tools that are available alongside rethinking the broad macroeconomic framework, including monetary policy, and reorientating it towards job creation and industrialization in the country. And so we need that coordination at a policy level. And I think that's where we can begin to, build some of the capacities, but also chart our economy towards an inclusive and rights-based economy.
And also about the language, I think that's absolutely critical to demystify. So to say that it's illegal, it's immoral, so that we start, Tanya touched on it. It's a beautiful word. It's called illicit financial flows. Isn't that wonderful? Isn't that a lovely term for theft? They are thieving. They are robbing countries blind globally. There is an island that has more companies than people on that island because they're hiding their wealth. And you know that some of the infrastructure that around tax evasion, which is just theft, corruption, was the main purpose of it was because very, very high wealthy individuals don't want to get caught up in divorce issues. And so it's their tax agents and the accounting firms, who we haven't even touched on, who enable this behavior because, God forbid, Bill Gates divorces his wife and doesn't want her to get any of the money. And so they set up these elaborate systems of trusts and so forth to avoid them being able to understand how much money they have. So let alone countries knowing how much money these people have, so we have to trust SARS that they can find the money.
Thanks to our host and the speakers. I think it's really such a phenomenal conversation that we're having today. Thank you. My name is Siviwe Mhlana. I've got two questions. I think the first question is really about holding this tension around other areas that we could be taxing. There's been laws promulgated and a hard push coming from Treasury to say, let's start taxing things like carbon, right? We're facing this ecological crisis that we are very much inside of. That ecological crisis comes about as a result of how we've industrialized and powered our economies using fossil fuels. And yet we also see resistance, especially from workers, organized workers, that actually, taxing carbons now starts to upset the interests of workers. And now climate change becomes, and dealing with the root cause of climate change now starts to be positioned as anathema to the cause of working class people in their many ranges, including those of us who fall in the middle income classes, precarious because also we are a paycheck away from disaster. So I'd like to maybe kind of just get a view on how do we start to square that circle, especially in a context like South Africa, where our economy is so fossil fuel dependent, and the practices of big corporates tends to be to pass that cost to the consumer when they should be internalizing that cost and changing their own behavior. So I'd like to maybe hear a view on that. My second question is a simple and perhaps the more complex question. So we're here, we're sitting in this room and outside in the overflow, listening to these wonderful interventions that make us feel really good. That yes, we've got to tax the super rich. Yes, we've got to tax corporations. But like, what can we do? You know, we can't like keep voting as though voting these people in and out is going to solve our problem, because they're all on the same side actually. So what is it that we who are here and those we organize with can do? Thank you.
The impact of climate change has a deeply working class impact. So when rivers overflow, it's not the rich in Gulf estates who lose their houses and lose everything. It's the poor who are living in informal settlements near riverbanks, as one example. When factories flood and workers can't work because everything is underwater, and we saw that in Durban, it's not the rich who are suffering, it's workers who don't get paid until the factories get operating again. They don't have insurance for that. Companies have insurance for that. We can go on and on. So workers, and certainly COSATU policy, is that we must address climate change to improve our lives and our family lives. There must be a transition, but a just transition. Not any transition, not a transition that is reinforcing the existing status quo. What makes a transition just? That nobody is left behind. Communities aren't left behind. Workers aren't left behind. So where we're introducing taxes, such as a carbon tax, for example, that can come. But if it's going to be just, only after a process of social dialogue. That would be with the industry, that would be with the budget. It would be to ensure first that there's social protection in place, so that if you are going to be affected, you're not left behind. It's going to be on the basis that where companies have to bring in new technology, that there is funding available for that technology on a grant basis, so that workers are not losing their jobs. Those preconditions must be there, else it is not a just transition. So it's a site of contestation. Of course, workers don't want to lose their jobs. None of us do. How do we protect ourselves? By making sure it's just. That notion of struggle and justice runs through many things. If we look at tax justice, we're only going to change things if we struggle. Struggle means having these conversations, building organization, mobilizing, going and showing what we want and want our strength, with a progressive view moving forward, with workers and the working class at the forefront.
Just in terms of what can be done, I'm going to put her on the spot because we have a representative of the Budget Justice Coalition in the room, Machodiso, if you could stand up. So it's a coalition of yes, they do ongoing, everyday grunt work on dealing with issues around tax justice, budget justice, debt justice, gender responsive budgeting. So that's one thing you can do, is get involved with the coalition. You can sit down now. You can get involved in the coalition. There are going to be a number of initiatives in the lead up to the medium-term budget policy statement that will be happening in October. And there's going to be marches and engagements. Get involved. People are going to be asking for tax justice. It's going to be on the table for many of those organizations, be it labor, be it civil society. There are a bunch of flyers that gives a little bit of information about the different myths and different discussions around tax that are at the front from the Alternative Information Development Center. They're a really lovely set of flyers. I recommend you take a look and take them home. And
hello, everyone. My name is Lerato. I have a question. So a lot of the conversation today has been about some kind of historical companies that have been avoiding taxation and things to that nature, right? So I'm noticing a problem that's becoming really prevalent now, and I want to know whether we're like on the ball with it. So I saw a stat recently from Stats SA about how something like 50% of a household's leisurely income or activity is going towards gambling. These and you mentioned something about these e-hailing services and these markets to that nature. So I want to know, we have the national lottery, right? So there's some regulation on that. Now we have all these companies just popping up all over the place. You go to the most dilapidated areas in Johannesburg, you see the fanciest building there is Betway, right? So what are we doing? Do we have something in place for these people coming here? Because they're leeching lots of money out of the country. How are they being taxed? And I don't have a lot of faith in taxing the people from the past, but there's something happening right now that can really fuck with us. So what are we going to do to stop them right now?
Nice.
That's my question.
As much as I mentioned that the conversation around taxes hasn't really been happening in the South African sense in the way that I've seen elsewhere, I also think that the evidence-based for South Africa also could be improved, particularly when we're speaking about, how to tax fairly, but also what the implications for taxes are. I think we're having a conversation here, but we're not able to say, well, what the alternatives might be, or what the implications of, say, increasing the tax threshold would be. Who would it benefit? How would that look like? Also, from the kind of revenue authority side, a lot of countries are struggling, to be fair, about trying to even identify, who's operating in the space, particularly when it comes to kind of digital economies and to this question about new corporations. That is much about kind of infrastructure for in the one sense, but also I think the ability for people to actually do their jobs and hold people accountable. So I think trying to identify them, determine who they are, also determine whether they're taxable, and implement that is one way.
But I think it's quite clear that our legislation is still lagging behind when it comes to digital services. And this is not just isolated to gambling. It includes other services as well that may not be as harmful. And so it speaks to like conversation we were having earlier around ensuring that the protocol that is currently taking place reflects the realities on the ground. And so we've raised the question, but more on extractive industries. And so I think there is a need to open up that question in terms of the revenue that is made by these companies, even as we are still finalizing questions about digital services, what can be done in terms of taxing them. And I think given the harmful effects that they have, it's a question that we should also look into. I know there are few in the policy space, especially Rise Mzansi has been quite vocal about it. But I haven't personally done any work, to look at the legislative framework and how we can improve it. But I think that's my take on it for now. But it's an important question to delve deeper into.
Thank you. My name is Buhle. My question seems self-serving now, given that the discussions have been around, how do we use tax for the greater good? But perhaps, this is also along those lines. For a long time now, I've been thinking that we as women should be demanding that the government taxes us less. Because we already pay, a high, our taxes to society are already high. And my view is informed by the fact that we live in a high crime country. And it is reversing our gains as women and making us poorer because it's determining where, our movement, where we can buy property. So the way I see it, if you're a woman and you want to buy property, you are more inclined or forced to go towards the sectional titles, maybe versus a man who's able to defend himself, who's able to buy a freestanding property. And we know that the levies that come with sectional property and estates, etc., eat on your income. And what happens to women later on in life when they retire, right? So they end up having less money compared maybe to men and also it also affects their quality of life and also what their children can inherit. So this is where I'm coming from, that how do we resolve this? You know, should women be taxed less?
I love this question. I think it's a difficult one to answer. As much as I would love to say yes, I do think that I'm one of the view. I mean, there's been studies, I think, in the 60s and 70s, kind of for wages for housework. But I think this one about taxing less is something that is different. I was recently in a conversation where it was mentioned, and I think Thoko also mentioned the rebates that come with medical aid payments. And the argument that was presented there was, well, if we're able to give rebates for wealthy people who can afford medical aid, what about the case, as I said, where people are not actually benefiting from social protections and social services, and that actually being carried by women and households in society? How do we consider that? I do think, as much as I do love the suggestion there, it would be difficult to measure the contributions that women make in their entirety. And this is the issue with only valuing things according to incomes, right? So as much as we can say we'll prioritize things that we can count, we can maybe do a kind of opportunity cost assessment in terms of whether you are the one that is cooking and cleaning in your household, etc. But there's a lot in terms of social reproductive work that women are doing that is going to kind of maintaining social relations, that goes to kind of the emotional labor that women are providing both in their households and in their communities, that we would not actually be able to count. And then it would be another question again about what work counts, what work are we valuing? And I think to the suggestion that I made earlier about policies and frameworks that actually value kind of gender justice and social well-being and human rights, prioritizing that, those are the things that I think would actually also benefit women in particular in society, because as you say, women are the ones that are doing this work.
The point that I want to leave you with this afternoon is, one, we all pay taxes. Two, who benefits from tax? So we must be wary of demanding tax justice for it to go into the arms industry or the military industrial complex or whatever it might be. So that's an important question for us to pay attention to, is where does our tax money go? Where is it currently going? And in the South African context, it's to the saver investors. They're very, very wealthy. So when you listen to the budget next year in 2026, watch that red line that they show you of who's getting paid first, before health, before education, before social development. So have a lovely mingle, enjoy the DJ, and thank you to the wonderful panel, to Tanya, to Siviwe, and to Zimbali. Big round of applause.
Can we give the incredible panel of Thoko, Tanya, Siviwe, and Zimbali another round of applause? I thought that was so beautiful.
My main takeaway from the taxation conversation was from the panelist Siviwe on taxing the informal sector and sort of how that is in direct disjuncture from taxing the super rich. So there's this kind of fallacy that if we tax the informal settlement, we would have resolved all our problems, and that's skewing away from our problems, so which is the super rich. So I thought that was very, very interesting that dynamic was brought in.
I'll say this. It's changed my opinion in the way that I've become a little bit more optimistic, in that I think that there are a lot of necessary critiques, but what I found refreshing about today's conversation is kind of the insertion of hope, not as an empty act, but as kind of the necessary motivation behind collective action, kind of discussion with view to really bringing out our informed perspectives and sharing that. So not assuming that there's a particular kind of tunnel vision version of what the truth is or what a correct path is, but recognizing that there are very real challenges and critiques that should be confronted, but there are spaces where they can be confronted in ways that take us towards thinking about and moving towards very practical solutions, not as kind of an individual kind of community or kind of organization, but literally as a collective, and what it means to do politics as a collective and to do political economy as a collective. I think recognizing that tax isn't purely kind of the notion of income tax. So it's not just a few people in society that are paying tax, but tax is fundamentally what each person contributes through direct and indirect means towards theoretically kind of sustaining our collective lives and identities, right? So yes, income tax, but also tax in the sense of levies, taxes on like VAT, value-added tax. So every purchase and transaction in some ways, there's tax. There's also arguably tax that's not necessarily in monetary terms, as I understand it, again, with the caveat that I'm not an expert in taxation matters. But I think why young people should be concerned about it is because literally, in some ways, it mediates every aspect of our lives as human beings, right? And arguably not just as human beings, but kind of in terms of corporate actors and state actors as well. What we can do and not, what our dreams can aspire to or not. So implications as to whether or not schooling at a primary, secondary, and even tertiary level, whether or not that is kind of accessible, whether it's subsidized, whether it's free, is a question of whether or not or how we're taxed, what the priorities are. So I think it is very relevant on many levels, kind of safety and security, food security are the roofs above our heads. So I think that they're, even as a lay person kind of in that space, I'm starting to, and I have an increased appreciation of the value of spaces that remind us how important the question of tax is, that sometimes gets kind of removed to a purely technical space. I think it affects all of us and we should all be concerned about it.
I think that we had enough conversations about what we ought to do and just kind of starting to spread the information. I think we're still at a very early stage in getting the action going, but I think that's okay. I think there's a lot of space for more education and then spreading the education beyond today. So yeah, that's basically what I took from this. It didn't really solve any problems yet, but it certainly gave a lot of answers for what we can do outside.